I'm Dan Couvret, the publisher of Family Lawyer Magazine and DivorceMag.com. And today I have the pleasure to be speaking with Brian McNamara. Brian is a Texas family lawyer. He's based in Kingwood, which is just outside of Houston, but he covers the whole metro Houston area. And he's a highly respected family lawyer. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Brian before. And today we're going to be talking about property division in Texas. And it's a very important subject, of course, for people going through divorce, how things are going to end up with their property. We're going to talk about the things you should do, and we're going to talk about the things that you shouldn't do. And Brian, thank you very much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Dan. I'm happy to do it.
Great. So let's start at the beginning and talk about how is property divided in Texas?
So Texas uses in divorce a scheme of community and separate property. Initially, at the outset of a divorce, the law says we must presume that everything that either spouse owns is community property. That gets divided. If a spouse can prove property is separate, it is not divided. Separate property is whatever existed before the marriage that still exists or can be traced to an existing asset. That can be a little complicated, but if someone had money before the divorce and can clearly show that they used that money to buy a boat, then that boat would be their separate property. It requires clear and convincing evidence. Anything acquired during marriage by inheritance, personal injury recovery, with some exceptions, or a gift, are also separate property. So gifts between spouses are separate. Everything else gets divided. There's no automatic 50-50. It's a good place to start, sometimes a good place to finish. The law just says a judge will divide it in a just and right division.
So let's talk about some of the terms that people are going to come up against. You mentioned separate property, community property. What are some of the other terms that they're going to hear that they may not be familiar with?
Yeah, so in the property side of it, and what I mean by that is not children, you will deal, of course, with what's community property, what is separate property. As I mentioned, we have tracing, which is where we try to determine how much of an asset could be separate, how much could be community. For example, if someone had a piece of real estate prior to marriage, during the marriage, they used community funds to pay down some of the mortgage. There may be some reimbursement claim there. Reimbursement is where one estate owes the other some money back. It is not tax accounting. It is not traditional accounting. It's legal. So sometimes CPAs have a little difficulty with this if they're not familiar with family law. But when we trace an asset, for example, which is a term that would come up, we're trying to figure out how much of it is separate, how much of it is community. If there's a claim for money to be reimbursed, you have two separate estates, one for each spouse, a community estate. Who is entitled to reimbursement, if any? Those are the kind of terms that can come up. There's a lot of others. I think we'll probably talk about retirement at some point, and quadro is another term that comes up a lot.
Right.
But the big ones are the community property, the separate property, the tracing, potential reimbursement claims. Reconstitution of an estate is where a spouse spends money or disposes of an asset inappropriately, and the court can reconstitute the estate by putting that money on that spouse's side of the ledger as if it still existed. So those are some of the terms.
Okay. So if you're the person who's initiating the divorce, are there any sort of first steps that you should take or things you should organize and think about?
Yes. One, talk to a family law attorney. This is not, it doesn't have to be me. I'm not trying to gin up business here. But it is very important, because one of the common mistakes people do is they become a Google lawyer or a Facebook lawyer, and they'll join a group, and they might be in a California group trying to figure out how to do a Texas divorce. And they can get very bad information. I highly recommend gathering information and education and learning what you're supposed to know. Like with anything else, building a house, you might want to learn a little bit about it, but you're going to have a contractor. If you get sick, you're going to have a physician. Likewise, see a lawyer early. The other thing is, if one spouse is thinking about divorce, the other one probably is too. So secure liquidity. If there is money in a bank or money that can be easily removed, secure it. The best way to secure it is to simply move it to an account in that spouse's name and then tell their spouse they've done it. It's much worse when someone logs on and realizes the account is zero. That's way worse
Right.
than being told. Tell them, I didn't know how you would respond. I have moved this money. It is secure. Here's where it is. It's in this bank under my name. Here's a copy of the deposit slip that shows what I put there. It's all on the up and up, but it's securing the liquidity.
Right.
The third thing I would say is gather documents. One of the very expensive parts of a divorce is getting information if people don't want to give it. So you gather documents about what you own and what either spouse owns or owes, at least 2 years worth. A lot of that's online. It used to be, going in file cabinets and getting out old bank statements, but now it's all online. It just
Right.
means converting it to PDFs and saving it because passwords will change and you will not have access. Things will disappear. If there's a business, go print the QuickBooks. Get all of that information. You can't have too much information. So those would be my initial recommendations.
So what if you're the spouse who's not initiating it and you're told that you're going to be getting a divorce? Is there anything that that person should do first, seeing that they don't have that advance notice?
I would say it's a lot of the same things. They may need to see a therapist, involve a therapist quickly, because if they're not seeking the divorce, sometimes the person who doesn't want to be divorced doesn't want to deal with the divorce. They want to deal
Right.
with saving the marriage, and that's understandable. I
Sure.
absolutely understand it, but it can put them at a terrible disadvantage. So, seeing a therapist to help them uh, emotionally move to the point where they can deal with this with a divorce is very important because they have to do the same thing. They have to see a lawyer quickly. They have to secure liquidity if it hasn't already been taken or moved. Then they have to gather as much documentation as they can to show what everybody has. If everybody gets along and there's no problems, having secured the documents is great, no problem. But if people haven't, it can cost a lot of money to get that information later. So it's
Right.
it's much the same advice with the addition of involving a therapist or if you're religious, a clergy person who has some therapy training to help you adjust to the fact that you're going to have to be in litigation with your spouse. And just as
Right.
an aside, I think it's I don't think most normal humans can make the adjustment from being in a marital relationship, even a bad marriage, to instantly being a litigant with that person. In the same place
Absolutely.
we do contracts and car wrecks. It's whether it's the right place to do it, it's where we do it, and it's very difficult.
Brian, I appreciate you bringing this up because having been through a divorce myself, you really are touching on the most important thing, the emotional aspect that you'll get to dividing assets and helping your children, but you've got to deal with yourself first. It's kind of like on an airplane, you got to put your mask on first and then help somebody else. So,
Oh,
uh,
absolutely. And the thing is, we know when we put the mask on is easy because we know what we want to. We want to survive
right.
that plane crash. When you don't want the divorce, it's hard to say put on your mask because you're preparing for a divorce you don't want.
Good point. So let's talk about the mistakes because you've been practicing family law for many, many years. What do you see as the three, or give us a number of mistakes that you see people making?
Yeah, some of them I've kind of referenced. One is uh, uh, probably the most common right now is Facebook lawyering and Google lawyering, where people decide that they don't need a lawyer, they know how to do this themselves.
Right.
And they get bad advice. And one example I've used since before Facebook, not an example, really, but is I don't know how many times in my life I've been to the dentist. I go regularly, but I am absolutely not qualified to look inside anybody's mouth. And just because somebody has been through a divorce or two does not make them an expert on divorce.
Right.
It's too. Every case is different. It involves anything that people can own or owe. So on the property side, we deal with anything you can own or owe. And different estates have different assets. different
Right.
needs. People are different ages, different stages in life. They need, first thing would be see a lawyer. The other mistakes would be, for example, sometimes people fixate on items that will not be important later. Tangible items like a, 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 um, a, a poster, for example, or a piece of furniture that is
Right.
emotionally important. But 2 years later, you don't want to be sitting looking at that poster thinking, gosh, I wish I had more retirement. And so it's those things, there's an emotional attachment, and we understand it, but it's important not to focus on those.
Right.
Sometimes people try to do their own um, division, and they want to go down the line and divide each asset 50-50-50-50, and that's very inefficient, administratively difficult, doesn't really address people's future needs. If we're trying to
Right.
get to a 50-50 of the estate, we can do that overall. Perhaps we move an entire residence to one spouse and then a big chunk of a 401k to the other one to get to the same place.
Right.
But those are mistakes that people make. Um, I know you asked for three, but I could say not following up on closing documents is a big one. So the judge signs a divorce decree, but we still have to do property deeds if property is being conveyed from one spouse to the other. We still have to do the post divorce division of the retirement via a quadro. You may have as simple as an auto power of attorney because the decree says one spouse gets the Jeep, and then they go to sell that Jeep 2 or 3 years later or trade it in, and
Right.
the dealer says, "Hey, your ex spouse has to sign the title," and the ex spouse says, "Oh, is that signature worth $5,000? How bad do you want it?" So there's a document that can be signed that lets you sign that title. Those things often get overlooked, and it's very important to follow up and get them done, and then set aside as best as someone can the anger because they can make a very bad deal uh, by being emotional.
Well, you could make that, talking about emotional, you could make the tell people, of course, that if you get it complete, the all the paperwork complete, it helps complete the process for you mentally as well as protecting yourself in the future, right?
For some, it does. For some, it does. Others, it takes them longer to move on if they don't want the divorce. And some people are mentally divorced long before that paperwork is signed.
Got it. So let's talk. You mentioned the home. It's probably in most people's cases, it's their largest asset. Is there anything in particular that you would tell people who are
So
thinking about or going through divorce
yeah,
with their home?
yeah. No, that's a good observation. Yes, it often is. Sometimes it's second to a retirement account. They may have a business, so it depends. But the house is always a substantial portion of the estate, unless it's just all debt because it's new. Um, One is the same thing that realtors will tell people: have a realistic view of the value of your house.
Right.
I think realtors also say that everybody thinks their house is unique and special, and even though every other house in the neighborhood is in a certain range, theirs is going to exceed that range. And you add on the emotion of divorce, it makes it much harder. But the truth is,
Yeah.
have a realistic value. Don't let the desire to have the house um, for an emotional reason lead you to a bad overall deal. I have seen someone's attachment to their house be so strong that they would take a very bad division. And I know later would regret it and look back and say, I've got this huge house note and nothing else. Why did I do that? And it was emotional. Um, uh, Let me see. And also the house, sometimes people think that they do a line item of divorce. They do list their assets and they say, here's the house, here's I want to give this house this much money. Well, you can, but it's better to do an overall division where we say house goes here, we're going to assign it this value, and by the time we move other things around and get to the bottom, we're at our desired percentage. It doesn't have to be exact line for line, dollar for dollar. um, but don't, that would be my advice, is have a realistic value and don't let an emotional attachment to the house lead someone to a bad deal
Got it.
overall.
Now, you've touched on retirement and you've mentioned the term quadros, which people may or may not be familiar with. Um, Are there any particular common errors that you see people make when it comes to retirement and doing quadros or not getting them done?
Yes. So retirement in the U.S. is complicated, and I say it like that because I've done several of these for expats who've gotten divorced overseas, and their decree, the overseas lawyers don't know anything about our retirement accounts. So what happens is most of our employer-sponsored retirement accounts are usually what's called ERISA qualified. That means they're governed by federal law, ERISA.
Right.
Uh, 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 Employee Retirement Income, Employee Retirement Security Act. Anyway, it's from the 1980s, and uh, it requires certain specific requirements to divide the retirement without having any tax effect. So and what it requires is what's called a qualified domestic relations order, also referred to as QDRO, for QDRO. And
Right.
what the QDRO does is it tells the plan administrator to carve out a new account for the non-employee spouse and move this much money from the employee spouse's retirement to the non-employee spouse's carved out amount with no tax consequences, no penalties, no transfer fees. Well,
Right.
no, I'm sorry. There is fees, but they're not very high. Fees to review the QDRO, but they're not taxes or penalties. Those are the big things. They do
Right.
charge a fee to review the QDRO and process it. Um, so what people will sometimes do is, it doesn't happen often, but they will. I have had people come in who tell me, okay, we've got a whole agreement. This is our first visit, but we've got it all worked out. I'm giving my spouse X dollars in the 401k, and I already drew it out and handed it to them. And I say, okay, unless we put, there is a time limit during which the IRS says you can put that money back. I don't remember. I think it's about 180 days, but please don't rely on that. I'm not certain. I always look it up. But if we're within the time limit, we might be able to move the money back. If not, that person, the employee spouse, is going to get a 1099, and the IRS is going to come looking for a bunch of money for taxes and penalties for drawing it out early. By doing it with a QDRO, you do not pay those. So that's probably the most common mistake I see people make with retirement. It doesn't happen often because right now there's a lot on the internet about how to QDROs. The other thing is um, not getting the QDRO started early in the divorce. So a deal will be made, it's signed, it's done, and then they try to get the QDRO done after and find that the signed agreement, whether it's a court order or an agreement, doesn't include all the necessary provisions. And now we have to try to either reach agreement or reopen the case. And that can be very it depends on this. Within Texas, it can be done. It just means you're basically reopening your divorce again, and nobody really wants to do that. It's not pleasant. You got to serve
Right.
your spouse. You've lost a lot of the negotiating leverage you had at the beginning or during the process. It's a whole different scenario. So I would say, with regard to retirements, is to have a lawyer who knows how retirement works and how QDROs work, because it's not just about how to write the QDRO. It's also when you're negotiating the division or presenting it to a judge, make sure the important things are highlighted and included in that division. And they vary plan to plan.
When you mentioned this, Brian, it also reminds me that people should be using a family lawyer, somebody who is a family lawyer, somebody who this is what they do all day, every day, not a lawyer who dabbles in family law. Because if you're not familiar with QDROs and retirement accounts, etc., they may not think of it until later on in the divorce. And like you say, they may be going back to start from scratch, more or less, on the negotiations, etc. So it's just highlighting the importance of an experienced family lawyer.
It's really important. I have had cases with lawyers who do all kinds of work because they're helping a friend or whatever. And some of them were just not very nice people. So at the end of it, wasn't my job to tell them how to do it right. They were not very nice to me throughout the case. So they left with a decree, and I knew there were things undone that they didn't know they were supposed to do. I
Right.
represent my client. No, and if everything's smooth and everybody's getting along, I don't mind saying, hey, don't forget you need to do these things.
Right.
If they've been arrogant, talking down, or whatever the case may be, because they think they're smarter than everybody else, then I'm like, okay, good luck. So it is
Right.
important to have someone who knows what all needs to be done, or you end up later on finding out you don't get the retirement you thought you were getting, or you in a dealership can't sell you, trade in your car, or worse, you're sitting at a closing and you find out that the house you got in your divorce you can't sell because you don't have a deed, and the closing title company says you got to go get your ex-spouse to sign a deed now.
Right.
And good luck. Depends on the relationship.
Absolutely. So let's move on and talk a little bit about business owners, for people who own a business. Is there anything that you would recommend for people who are owning a business and they are getting a divorce, of course, and they want to do whatever they can do to make sure there's a smooth transition? And I guess you should touch on, well, how is the business divided? Is it like every other asset?
Yeah. So I guess the simplistic answer would be have a prenup or a postnup that addresses the business. Um, and there's a whole lot of information on my website about prenups, because if you have two business partners who are not married, they are just business partners, and if they're going to end that business, it can be smooth. They could agree. One could say, "Hey, we've always got along great. I want out. Will you buy me out?" And the other says, "I want to keep operating the business. Yeah, let's make a deal, and I'll pay you X dollars a month for your interest until you're paid off, and it'll be supplemental retirement income, and everybody's happy." Or it can be one of the business owners is spending too much of the money on their own. They're not accounting for it. They just have huge disagreements, big fights, and they say, "We're going to end this. And they both say to the other, "I want you out." And that's bad litigation. Now, put a marriage on top of that with a divorce. And what I'm trying to say is there's no simple answer. Uh, there really isn't. Some of what we talked about at the beginning is important. Gather records. Print all of the QuickBooks, or copy. Actually, you just copy the QuickBooks to the cloud or a jump drive or whatever. Copy the QuickBooks. Copy everything, because business owners find themselves locked out. They get to work and all the locks are changed. And the police aren't going to do anything. They're going to say, "Hey, you both own this. Good luck. Talk to lawyers."
Right.
So it's important to get all of the records, um, and see a lawyer who has, again, what you had said, not just family law experience, but business experience too. Uh,
Yes.
I used to do a lot of civil litigation, and I did deal with these just as litigation matters. And when I found that's where I came to realize when you put a divorce on top of it, it gets really messy. Um, a judge can issue an order that says who, assuming they have equal interests, who is in charge of the business while the case is on file. Sometimes there's a business formation agreement, a partnership agreement. Sometimes they just get a cookie cutter one, but nonetheless, there's one there that says if the business, if we want to end our partnership, here's what we do. They typically don't, all of the boilerplate cookie cutter business partnership agreements do not assume the parties are married. They tell you what will happen if you want to end the business if one wants out. So sometimes we can work within that in the context of divorce to get some guidance. If a judge is asked to decide, the judge will want to look at that and try to see how much can we do here within the confines of what was agreed. Even if they didn't read it, they agreed to it when they signed it.
Right.
So we try that, but it can be messy.
Is there any particular mistakes that you see business owners or professionals like dentists or doctors or other people you've done divorces for? Is there anything specific that they should be on the lookout for?
Well, one is they sometimes assume divorce is simpler than it is, especially with some professionals. They will think that they don't need a lawyer. They already know how to do this. Uh, Obviously, I don't agree with that, and I've had this conversation with physicians and dentists and engineers about how I'm not going to try to set a broken bone or pull a tooth or build a bridge. Why do they think they can do a divorce?
Right.
But nonetheless, um, that would be one thing that they do. It is very important to see a lawyer, because lack of knowledge can cost a lot of money. In Texas, professional licenses are separate property. The business may be community, but a physician's license, for example, is not community property. So if a doctor is representing themselves against a spouse who has a lawyer, they could end up having to pay way more for the rest of their life than they should have because they think the other spouse is entitled to a piece of the income from their degree because they were married while they went through medical school. So that is important in terms of those professionals. In terms of the other business owners and all professionals, really, the biggest mistake, which is also the hardest to overcome, is letting emotion get involved. Um, you've got to if your spouse is involved in the business, there's all the emotion of divorce, and that sometimes causes people to make mistakes. They take money they shouldn't take. They start dragging customers into their divorce by saying, "Hey, you need to deal with me, don't deal with my spouse." And the customers don't want to do that. They end up running them off to a new business, and neither spouse benefits.
Right.
So that would probably be the most important thing: is to try to set aside the emotion and listen to the advice of a good lawyer who's not emotionally involved in that.
I know you also deal with some of your clients have lots of assets, high incomes. Is there anything specifically about those people, high net worth divorce cases that you think are relevant to mention?
Well, first of all, it depends which spouse we represent, right? Because sometimes if it's just a high net worth estate, it's not that much different than any other, except that it ends up taking more time to gather information and create the spreadsheet of assets and debts. Sometimes it takes more time to value the debts because there could be businesses, there could be real estate, there could be business holdings where they're part of a real estate investment trust or something. It takes a while to figure out what's the value of it. So in that respect, it's not that different, and it is uh, better to divide a net positive estate than a net minus. So the high net worth is, in some respects, whenever Jeff Bezos got divorced, I'm sure it was easy for his wife's lawyers to say, "I guarantee I'll get you $1 billion," much rather than have to tell her, "Hey, we're going to be fighting over how much of this debt you're going to have to take."
Right.
But so it really is a question of gathering information and putting a value on everything initially. The dividing of it, if we can't negotiate it, we can go to court, we can get experts, we can do all of that. The majority are resolved by an agreement, but that would be the most important part there. With regard to high wage earners, that depends on whether we're representing the wage earner or the spouse. One of the things that executives have are sometimes they have executive retirement plans that are not ERISA qualified. There's no quadro, and they're often administered through a different part of the company. So if we send a subpoena to HR, we may not get that information. We have to dig a little deeper to find out who administers the executive level plans. And we have to get the plan documents to understand them because they're not subject to ERISA. So they're very different documents. The same with compensation plans. Sometimes I've had to get experts involved just to help me understand the compensation because there's money coming from different places, and some's quarterly, some's monthly, and some is doesn't seem to have as random is the best way to say it. And we're trying to figure out how much does this person make and how often. Uh, so those are some of the things we look at there.
So a lot of people going through divorce are wondering about getting their fair share, and I'm not quite sure what that means to divorcing people, their fair share, but how do you help ensure that your clients get their fair share?
Yeah. So as far as how we do it is all the things that you and I talked about. Ultimately, in Texas, most courts will order mediation before divorce, before trial rather. So traditionally, we would have said, "Judge, we can't make an agreement. We need a trial." They would give us our trial date. Now the judge will say, "First, try mediation. If that doesn't work, then we'll have a trial." And so mediation is with a neutral third party, a lawyer party on one side, lawyer party on the other side. Neutral party tries to help them make a deal, get an agreement. The majority are resolved there.
I see.
So if you've got all the information you need and a good lawyer, and you come out of there with an agreement, then usually within the realm of fair. People can sign off on a bad agreement just to bring it to an end, but fair is It's broad and it's very subjective because it really comes down to at mediation, someone says, uh, okay, I'm willing to sign this to start bringing this divorce to an end and move on with my life. Nobody's ever thrilled about their divorce agreement. So it basically say, this is fair enough that I can do this to bring this to an end and move on with my life. Um, and so that's kind of a subjective sense of whether it's fair. I mean, there's no objective measure. When you sell a house, you say, you want to know what it's worth? Put it on the market. They'll tell you, the market will tell us what it's worth. It doesn't work that way in divorce because when you go to trial, you're getting a judge who's bringing all of their proclivities and idiosyncrasies and whatever else. So they'll tell you what you're getting, but you still may think it's unfair. Um, so that's a hard. That's and even just I'll just add this: the family code says it shall be divided in a just and right division, and that's pretty vague. So there have been cases that say to the courts of appeals, help us understand what does just and right mean, and they'll say it means fair and equitable, which is they can't define it any better than we can because I don't know what fair and equitable means either. I do know what a good divorce agreement looks like because I've done it long enough, uh, but there's no objective way to sit down and measure it.
Brian, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. I also want to encourage people who are in the Houston area to check out Brian's website. It's McNamaraLawyers.com. And more importantly, pick up the phone or send Brian an email because you would be very well served if you hired Brian. He's an expert in the field, been doing it a long time. And he has also, he mentioned the civil experience that he has really helps in terms of doing divorce work because he brings that background as well. So thank you for joining me today, Brian. It's been a real pleasure as usual.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks very much.